Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics. I'm Anita, and here with my co-host, Ryan.
Thanks. I'm glad to be back.
President-elect Donald Trump recently made his own challenge to the liberal rules-based global order by articulating an expansionist U.S. foreign policy focused on regaining control of the Panama Canal, owning Greenland, and referring to Canada as the 51st state. We discuss the likelihood of such a foreign policy agenda and how seriously we should address Trump's tendency towards blustering remarks. Then we review and grade the last 4 years of Biden's foreign policy. Is the U.S. better or worse off than when he took office? So, what's going on with us?
What is going on with that?
It's kind of a valid question. I mean, I was just thinking, we've been busy, and ironically, that's given us less to talk about.
Oh, that we've been busy?
Yeah, traveling to Arkansas and back,
that's
and the holidays.
To talk about. Yeah. I mean, we had good holidays, good New Year's. Went to Arkansas.
Saw my family.
Saw your family. Went to Arkansas basketball game.
Yeah, they won that game. They haven't won since, but they won that game.
What clearly goes back to my theory is I had to attend these things to.
Sure, Arkansas only wins if you're there. It means they would win one game a year.
No, I give them the extra juice for the big.
Oh, okay.
That's what
sure.
I convinced now.
You should have been at the Tennessee game then.
Yeah, they may have done it. I'm sure that would have closed the 20, 30-point gap.
Yeah. So I beat you and everyone else in fantasy football this year.
Oh, well, yeah. Yeah, that was something.
And I want to point out how sad it is that my husband roots against me every year.
Yeah, we root against you because you've won 6 out of the We've been doing this league for 13 years, and you've won 6, so nearly 50% of the championships. Now you have to understand that any franchise that has a win record like that, we're talking the Patriots under Brady, we're talking the Yankees during, I don't know, Jeter or something. Maybe even the Cowboys didn't go on that long of a streak. But these are all teams that are reviled by everybody else that is not those teams. You just have to understand that. People don't like overly successful franchises.
I don't know. I'm under 50%. That's my point. If I was 50 or above, then I understand. But I'm under 50%.
No, anywhere, the respectable amount. Now, mind you, it's only 8-person league, so a respectable amount.
It's a small league.
It's 3. 3.
3 out of 13.
3 to 4. Yeah, 3 to 4 out of 14. Nobody would be giving you a hard time then. You'd be respected every year, but because you were too dominant. Now, the dominance has slowed slightly compared to the first half where you were well over 50%.
Yeah.
And that was really bad. But you cemented in your reputation at that point. And then I think it's also the fact that you talk down your team the entire time, all the way up to the point where you win the championship. And it's oh, look at me.
Because here's the irony. I barely got in the playoffs, but then
I don't.
Ended up as the first seed.
You ended up at the first seed. You weren't barely got in. How do you end up at the number 1 seed and you're I barely got in?
I had to win 3 in a row to get in.
It's stuff like that. And you're complaining about your team the whole time. And you're just racking up wins. And then you just crush everybody in the championship. And it's look at me. Why is everybody not like me and my winning ways?
Yeah, exactly.
Hopefully one day you understand. Anyway, that's why you have the nickname Belichick.
Yeah. It's
now really an insult coming from my family because Belichick is now the coach of our number 1 rival, UNC. So
yeah, but the nickname came way before that.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, do you still have that sweatshirt, the cutoff? I never see that.
I should wear that.
It's disappointing.
Well, I'm usually too cold to wear it.
It's the raggedy arms cut off the sleeve. New England Belichick sweatshirt. Yeah.
Maybe if it ever warms up around here.
Yeah, maybe. Anyway, it'll definitely be the number 1 thing for our league next year to beat you and at least keep you down to winning once every 3 years or so. I think that's barely respectable, but
I did notice that I had been in top 3 finishes 10 of those 13 years, but that meant there was 3 years I didn't even finish in the top 3.
Geez. See, this is why everybody's annoyed by this.
I don't know why.
Yeah, you're just oh, I'm so cute. Look at me. No,
exactly.
It's not cute. It's not cute.
It is cute. All right. So on to President-elect, or God Emperor, as you call him, Trump, who on the 7th gave an hour-long news conference at Mar-a-Lago where he focused on expansion of U.S. territory covering the Panama Canal, Greenland, and calling Canada the 51st state, called for the renaming of the Gulf of Mexico, and demanded that NATO members should be spending 5% of GDP on national defense, which is weird because we don't spend 5% of GDP on national defense.
Right, but I am beginning to see a lot more arguments that we should be spending 5% of GDP on national defense.
Yeah, but at the same time, you know, Elon and his squad are talking about, oh, we have to cut spending in the Defense Department.
Yeah, that's why there is a big split in MAGA world on certain issues like that. But I think I've seen more arguments on that 5% side. But getting there, probably unlikely.
Yeah, I think so. Starting with the Panama Canal, what's the justification to use military force to retake it?
Yeah, so this implies there's justification. No, I think the main thing that Trump has pointed to is a couple different things. So one is that in 2023, that the fees for transversing the Panama Canal increased a lot. And that was mostly because of drought conditions, because with the canal, you have to have like a spare water source in order to kind of make up differences and losses within the canal. That lake that they use for this water source has been running low. Mm-hmm. So they can't have as many ships to go through. So in order to maintain the same amount of revenue, you have to increase the fees per ship, because the U.S. is the number one transporter through the canal. They see those increases in fees the most. So one of it is, hey, there's this big increase in fees. So Trump's complaining about that.
Not justification for taking it over, though.
And that's the point that the Panamanian president has made, who I'll note, and was interested to note, he's very pro-Trump. He's a conservative guy. He's pro-business. He's hoping to help out, like on the immigration deportation issue. So this is really, you know, in terms of Latin America, where Trump may not have a lot of allies, this is definitely one of his stronger allies. So, you know, from that point, it's like, well, why is he picking fights with this guy? But yeah, the whole idea around the treaty is that there's neutrality involved. So no country is treated any differently in terms of the fees charged for it. So I don't know, there's no justification for trying to get a better deal or feeling like the U.S. is targeted in some way, like there's some anti-American. Now, the other component, which I have seen like a paper out by CSIS that did say that maybe there are potential security issues around having a Hong Kong company in charge of managing the gates. Says the ships enter and exit the 51-mile long canal, that having a Hong Kong company that potentially, it's not saying that it is currently, but potentially could serve as like a conduit for Chinese intelligence, and in a crisis, you know, maybe shut off the canal. Although that would be a violation of the treaty in and of itself. And then the U.S. would be justified to take military action to reopen the canal. Not to take it over, but to reopen it, because that's the only thing under the 1977 treaty that is allowed for the U.S. to intervene, is if it's like shut off completely.
Yeah, so I think that's an important point, that even when just military force is justified under the treaty, it's not to regain control of the canal, but to reopen it, to make sure that no one is closing it to U.S. ships.
Yeah, and I was a little surprised, because I think my initial take was, well, it's any time maybe like neutrality is seen as being violated, and the U.S. had like a lot of leeway in terms of when it could intervene and when it couldn't. And then, oh, maybe you could make a legal justification with this Hong Kong tie on the gate company. But no, it's as long as the ships are, you know, everybody's being charged the same rate and the ships are being allowed to pass through the canal, then there's really no justification for military intervention by the U.S. under international law.
So do you think Trump would try to pursue some type of military force for this? Or is it all bluster?
No, I think it's all bluster. I'm not exactly sure. I think unlike when we talk about Greenland, I'm not exactly sure what the end game is here, because other than just a strong arm Panama into having a special rate for U.S. where, I mean,
Wouldn't neutrality mean that they would have to have the same rate for
I feel like it's a
everyone?
violation of neutrality. Like it's forcing them to reduce their rates across the board, which just affects the country's revenue. I'm thinking that the operation of this canal is probably a significant portion of the Panama economy. They had to invest a lot over the last decade in modernizing the canal in order to allow big modern ships through. So they had an investment of, I think, upwards of like $4 billion. So it just affects kind of the recouping of those costs and probably the overall economy, all of which does not make them, I think, would damage the greater goal around immigration and cooperating on that. So I think this one, the consensus on the stuff I was reading was like, what is the end game here and why is he so fixated on Panama? Especially, I could see if it was like a leftist government. And then you're like, okay, yeah, I'm going to like with Mexico's government, I'm going to strong arm them and attempt to get these concessions. And maybe, yeah, it would be a greater chance for greater gain for like military intervention. But here, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah. I mean, when we discussed this before, my point was I don't think the military would ever go along with this sort of action just because Hong Kong operates
You'd have to come up with some pretty selective intelligence, or I'm not saying this is old yellow cake powder thing of Iraq again, but something along those lines where you come up with some sort of excuse, unless you really don't care. But that's such naked belligerence and sends the message, and of course the damaging message that anybody can just go and take territory. And maybe the Trump administration really doesn't care.
But again, that's why I don't think the military would go along with it.
I don't know if there would be such a pushback.
I know you said that, but why not?
On something that would escalate, something that's not, okay, this is extremely dangerous, because obviously the operation itself, the military would have no problems executing. It would be
the security of its troops around the world. It would be alliances. It would be...
the alliance aspect, and then the message it sends. I think it's the endangerment and message it sends to China in particular. I mean, Russia, obviously, but Russia's already kind of crossed that line. But yeah, the Chinese see this, and the Chinese have an interest in the Panama Canal. They are the second biggest user of the canal. Yeah, for some reason, I don't see the military under Hegseth, under a new administration, really pushing back against something like this.
Really?
Just because the line and the consequences aren't necessarily immediate. I feel like this one maybe I don't think it's coming up. I think this is bluster, but it's hard to see an end game to it.
Yeah.
But I think we've just forgotten, a lot of these things get brought up and then they get dropped. That was the pattern during the first Trump administration. There's a lot of bluster. He says stuff in these long press conferences. They're outrageous. And then it gets dropped. Except now Greenland, I think, is a different story.
Yeah. So what is so different about Greenland? And why are we considering expansionist goals with Greenland, of all places, where it's not very populated? It's mostly ice.
Yeah, I think this is really, for whatever reason, I think during the first Trump administration, there was a lot of emphasis on competition within the Arctic Circle. And that's certainly something that both Russia and China have put great emphasis on. And you had two different people speaking to Trump about this issue during the first Trump administration. One was, as you would probably expect, fellow New York socialite Estee Lauder heir Ronald Lauder. I didn't dive into a lot of the details. He does have ties to the Danish government, though. And then, from your home state, Arkansas, Senator Tom Cotton.
I was surprised to see that, because I was like, what does Tom Cotton care about Greenland?
I think probably around the competition with China and maybe to a lesser extent Russia at the time, so that this was emphasized. And I think the biggest thing was the window of opportunity, because this really comes about because Greenland, who's long, was established as a colony of Denmark back in I think as far back as the 1800s, has been getting greater levels of independence. So they became self-governing in the 1970s and have their own parliament. And then in 2009, the Danish government said, okay, anytime that you have a referendum and your push for independence is approved, then that's something that the Danish government would honor. So they have not had that referendum yet, but it's seen as inevitability. The majority of the Greenland population, now the population is under 60,000. It's comprised mostly of Inuit by background, so a native, but it's also mixed with Danish. So most people are like a Danish Inuit mix. And yeah, they're definitely critical of the Danish government or pushing for self-governance. That being said, I mean, the island itself, which, a lot of the theories going around are, Trump was attracted to it because you look at one of those old school maps called the Mercator map that distorts like the Northern Hemisphere and all the countries in the Northern Hemisphere. And I think anybody in grade school can remember looking at that map. And Greenland is like the size of Africa. It just looks huge. So a lot of people think just Trump was like, oh my God, this place is something the size of Africa. Is slowly, because of climate change, all the ice, which covers about 3/4 of Greenland, is melting. And you're having this gigantic island that is filled with rare earth minerals and silver, and supposedly has 52 billion barrels of offshore oil. So it's just this gold mine, almost literal gold mine of resources that are up for grabs. Because a population of 56,000 would be hard pressed to defend it or to develop. Because there's not a lot of infrastructure. There's really just one main city within Greenland. They receive a subsidy from the Danish government of 500 million. That represents a good part of kind of how they operate and have a Scandinavian type welfare system. So I think it was like that opportunity set presented itself. And that's really what got them talking is, hey, they're going to be independent soon. Let's see if we can just buy this chunk of land.
Well, I mean, that's what's weird. Like, what does independence have to do with Trump buying the country?
Yeah, that's the mixed thing because obviously there's been a lot of articles that have come out since then. And they don't seem to have a clear strategy because they're treating this like a colonial project, which the Danes don't even have the right to sell the island. But they keep approaching and looking to punish Denmark because they won't sell it. Well, it's not theirs to sell. I mean, the natural resources are formally managed and owned by the people of Greenland. But it's seen as, until they have independence, you really don't have a negotiation partner of whether or not, because it would be up to those 56,000 people, whether they wanted to arrive at an arrangement with the United States.
Right. I mean, it's weird to be like, we're going to get independence and then we're going to give that up to be part of the U.S.
Yeah, that's a choice. I thought the most interesting thing that I read was The Economist actually tried to calculate what would you offer for Greenland? And my first thought was like, oh, this is going to be trillions of dollars because of all the minerals and oil and resources there. But the fact is they've tried to approach investors about, and that's what's always kind of funny. We've talked about this before, and you know it better than I do. But they say, okay, this is the second biggest reserve of rare earth minerals on the planet next to China. But one, rare earth minerals aren't rare.
There are plenty,
in the US. And you think it's going to be cheaper to process them in Greenland with its unique harsh conditions and high environmental standards versus like Arkansas, where there was recently a big deposit of lithium.
Right. And just distinguished as a critical mineral. I guess the thing in my head was that Trump thinks that he can get Greenland and then not have to follow any environmental procedures.
Well, one, no, I don't know. No. Not if the people of Greenland have any. I mean, I don't see them dropping their current EU standards. I mean, because their livelihood is dependent on clean air and water, because most of their economy is based on fisheries. Now, under the Economist model, what it came up with is said, okay, well, this GDP produces like a certain amount, but they also would cost the U.S. You'd have to continue to pay them $500 million to support their lifestyle. So we assume all of that, and then you do the future cash flow and you discount it. And they came to a term of $50 billion, which for the U.S. is cheap. It's super cheap. $50 billion for Greenland. That puts no value for the minerals and other aspects, the strategic aspects of it. And you would essentially pay with that amount, you would make every citizen a millionaire or multimillionaire. So that would be kind of the appeal of it, is there's a very limited number of people on there. They're saying, okay, become part of the U.S. and everybody gets a $1 million check.
I mean, if it was just like a protectorate or something, or like, I don't know, whatever, Guam or what that is, territories, do they still have the same rights to protect the environment?
I think the places where U.S. law applies, everything under the Clean Air and Water Act would still apply. So, how individual states obviously have some leeway, but they have to meet the federal minimums of that. So you would still have to meet the same standards that Arkansas would have to meet. Now, you wouldn't have the higher standards like a California would have to meet. But you would certainly have that. But they would have the right to have local standards as well. I don't think, even as a protectorate, you're not allowed to set some sort. And I can't imagine them giving up the equivalent of state rule or local rule when they have that currently with Denmark. I mean, why would they?
Yeah.
I mean, unless you are cutting them that $1 million check, maybe they make that choice and are like, oh, well, we could be bought off. That's fine. All of this is a bit fanciful. I mean, I think this one actually has a more logical endpoint. And I think, we're the adults within the Trump administration. There's few. There are some.
Are there?
Yeah, sure. They're pointing towards what is called a free association agreement, which is something we have with like certain Pacific islands like Micronesia, which allows the U.S. would have exclusive military access. And then in exchange for that, we're giving them access to developmental grants and infrastructure funding and things along those lines. I mean, we already have, in terms of strategically being able to monitor the Arctic Circle, we have a base that was set up during World War II in the northern part of the country, like within the Arctic Circle. That's for early detection, air defense detection, and a small air base there. Now, obviously, with further arrangements, we can expand that presence within Greenland and still have the same kind of access or more favorable access towards any company looking to develop the region. That being said, I mean, I think I mentioned earlier, the Prime Minister of Greenland did like a tour of the U.S. looking for investors in 2021, and just nobody was interested in taking that on.
Yeah, I mean, that's always like some of the irony of what we say, like we need to develop more mining of critical minerals. And we have them in the US, but the process doesn't make it economical, and trying to protect the environment complicates things, and that we don't really then find it in our economic interest to do so, even though it is in our security interest. So it seems like some of the same issues would be there with Greenland. So you don't think that Trump is going to use military force to force independence or this believe? I mean, Trump is capable of believing that Denmark could sell it despite its reality to do so.
Yeah, no, that's definitely off the table because, I mean, that's just naked colonialism. And what the Danes have already agreed with the people of Greenland, that would violate, kind of this 2009 terms anyway. So, it seems like a prerequisite for anything is for the people of Greenland to hold a referendum and to declare independence. And then if you wanted to pursue some sort of arrangement, then you're doing direct negotiation with their representatives. So that being said, I mean, what seems to be happening is they're trying to lay the groundwork for that over time. And that's part of, Don Jr. and Charlie Kirk and headed over to Greenland this past week. And there was an interesting article in Politico. And there are a handful of MAGA fans within Greenland. They talked about this one guy that basically met them at the tarmac and with all his MAGA gear. And yeah, he talked and he was like, yeah, it's just people are brainwashed because they just get the Danish news and that's all, it was pro-Kamala and anti-Trump. But, when I'm talking to people, we're on message boards in Greenland and it's in, our native language, we're pretty pro-Trump. And so this guy is running for their parliament. So I think one early step, again, it's only a population of 60,000. So yeah, one guy could be important. So there's this, and a good opportunity for him. He's, has very high level contacts at this point with the U.S.
Yeah.
So we'll see how he does in this election that they have coming up for parliament, and who knows, maybe. But all polls with all of this are basically usually like 5% supporting whatever Trump is proposing around this, around the Panama Canal, around Canada. All of it has about like 5 to 10% support within the country.
Yeah. So it sounds like we don't think that Trump is going to use military force to force Denmark to do something about Greenland, or force Greenlanders to do something. Because it's all
then people are like, whoa, what happens when a NATO country attacks another NATO country and that enacts Article 5? And I assume under this situation, we've already pulled out of NATO. If we're invading Greenland, we've already abandoned Ukraine and we've abandoned NATO and we're just going whole hog back to the future, the 19th century.
Yeah. But definitely something, you have to address what we think is going to happen in Greenland. I think more than the Panama Canal because of Trump's very long focus, since this was a focus of his first 4 years too.
Yeah. And I think this one has greater legitimacy just because, China has also expressed interest. And Greenland's been on the U.S.'s radar for a very long time. And when we purchased Alaska, Sewell, I can't remember. I'm probably not pronouncing that right. He was the Secretary of State at the time, was lambasted for purchasing Alaska at the time from Russia. But at the same time, he approached Denmark and tried to buy Iceland and Greenland at the same time and was turned away. And then Truman, right after the war, which is probably good timing when you think about it, because European economy is devastated. Truman rolls up with $100 million in gold and it's like, hey, I would like Greenland, please. Also turned away. So it's been on the U.S. radar for some time. And then beginning in 2007, when China showed interest, and this is the period when China was beginning to look all over the world. They had made the decision already about kind of transitioning to renewables and kind of the rare earth monopoly and all those sort of things. So it's been on the U.S. radar, so I don't see it going away. Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of interesting. So what about Canada being the 51st state?
Oh, that's happening. That's happening for sure. Look, he already forced Trudeau single-handedly to resign. Nothing else is going on in Canada to cause that. Everybody knows that all the Canadians are huge MAGA supporters. We saw the big truck envoy. I'm pretty sure that was supported by 100% of Canadians. And let's be honest, they just want to be they're basically like a little brother. And they'd be part of the big boy.
They don't like having autonomy over their own.
Come on. No. That's overrated. Look, they still have friggin' King Charles or Queen Elizabeth on the currency. They clearly need a big boy to take care of them. They never rebelled. They should welcome it. Whereas one of the incoming Texas congressmen, they should be honored that Trump thinks them worthy of American citizenship.
So would they be a blue or red state?
Well, I already said it was 100%. So clearly it's a big old red state.
Oh, okay. So
now this assumes that everybody feels like we're the oil with Calgary, Alberta, kind of western part. Everybody else in the country feels that way, right?
Right?
Yeah.
All the urban areas.
Yeah. They're all. They
agree with these unpopulated areas.
Well, clearly, because Trudeau's run that country in the ground.
Well,
every house there is like $3 million. And they basically imported the entire country of India in. So they're a mess.
The whole country of India.
Practically half of it. It wasn't crowded when we went to India. Come on. They were all in Canada.
Wow.
Yeah.
I missed that on my last trip to Canada.
So all
In fact,
the
I don't remember seeing any
Canadians are itching to just like ditch that loser Ottawa government and join the big boy Trump party.
Yeah.
Trump train. Choo choo.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Makes a lot of sense.
It does make a lot of sense. I'm sure.
Okay. So enough fun about Trump and all the useful topics he gives us, and will, I'm sure, continue, especially when he actually assumes the presidency. But we wanted to look back on the last 4 years. So moving on to Biden's foreign policy legacy, he came in promising to rebuild old alliances and defend democracy and basically, strengthen the idea of a liberal rules-based order that had somewhat deteriorated under Trump. How do we think he did?
Well, I think, he came in with certain expectations, and certainly what he faced. The biggest thing was just that sense of chaos. And we're seeing it right now. Even Trump's not even president yet. Mm-hmm. He's just held a 1-hour news conference that was very foreign policy, as we just discussed. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was like that for 4 years. Mm-hmm. It was just, one crazy thing after another. So there's just this sense of tiredness. Obviously, when he left office, the number one thing was the global pandemic and dealing with that and kind of all the consequences of it. And just this sense of, we've abandoned our allies. Europe was beginning to shift more and more towards China. Mm-hmm. Because U.S. was seen as an unreliable partner. Same within Asia. It seems like, despite Trump's bluster, despite the tariffs put in place, China was much more, at least, before COVID, was much more aggressive in its posturing within the South Pacific, certainly within its rhetoric. So just like there was this sense of a little bit of chaos, of professionals not being in control, of abandoning the traditional alliance network that was been set up and is the key to U.S. power since World War II. So they came in with kind of those expectations, and then it's the whole Mike Tyson thing. It's like you have a plan till you get punched in the mouth, and almost immediately Biden administration gets punched in the mouth. Well, several times over and over.
The first thing it started out with was its, own failure. The rest, I think, are just circumstances that happened that they had to deal with. But the withdrawal of Afghanistan.
Yeah, let's talk about that one, because that was the first major foreign policy decision kind of facing the Biden administration. And they came in, Trump had already negotiated this flawed agreement directly with the Taliban, largely leaving the Afghan government out of the negotiation, together with a timetable. The Biden administration stuck with that timetable, regardless of kind of the conditions on the ground. And obviously, everyone was surprised by just how quickly that government and the military fell apart, basically sweeping across the country and then leading to a disastrous pullout, along the lines of Saigon in the Vietnam War. My personal opinion is this was a failure 20 years in the making. Sticking it all on the Biden administration is bullshit. He was the one who executed the terms of the agreement. I didn't like the fact that this was all put, like the Blinken interview was being put on the State Department. I think the biggest failure is probably the DOD. We saw this with ISIS too. They spent all this time training these native forces, training these groups, and they capitulate immediately. Maybe it's because unbelievably endemic corruption in both of those instances. But it seems like there's some sort of issue where we have these partners on the ground, and as soon as, we pull out any support, regardless of the military resources and the huge amount of training that are provided, that they capitulate immediately. Mm-hmm. And I don't know it's 20 years of failure. It's just 20 years of abject failure. And it's the guy holding the bag at the end that gets the entirety of the blame, even though it should belong to 4 different administrations.
Seems to me you're a lot more gracious to Biden now than you were during the time that it happened.
Well, no, my whole point was that it was going to be always used against him. And it was politically used again. Now, was it critical? No. I mean, it was always dominated by domestic, but it was the number one thing. I mean, one, that's when his poll numbers dropped and never recovered. He had like a honeymoon phase that lasted till August of that first year. And then the disastrous pullout. And then his numbers dropped like a rock. Now, mind you, that was also the same time like when inflation was beginning to kick up. But it was triggered by that because it was just seen as the biggest thing with the Biden administration coming in. People wanted to see competence, competence. And when you see that and you just see things completely out of control, that's not what you expected. That's not, and that was like the first big disappointment. Because I think up to then, like the management of the late part of the pandemic, the rollout, the additional aid, all of those things were really well done. The repair, towards the alliance system beginning at that point. But then you saw this and it was just like, it just signaled gross incompetence.
Yeah.
Failure or not. I mean, again, it goes back to 20 years of failure. But it looked like gross incompetence.
So you are okay with the fact that no one actually took responsibility for this happening?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. No, yeah, because the other thing with competence and being adults in the room is the buck stops there. Mm-hmm. So somebody needed to be held accountable. And I guess, that's the one thing. I mean, Trump was always firing people. And that was too much. That was too much chaos and too much turnover, but not holding a general responsible for the chaoticness. I mean,
was it really anyone's fault?
I don't know. Well, the problem is, I don't think, has there been done a full after action review, like a 9/11 commission for this? I think Congress had talked about doing that, but I'm not aware of like a full report going into, were there, because I don't know if there were specific things on the ground that would have allowed a more phased pullout. Because at least with Saigon, God, it took them a year to conquer South Vietnam.
Yeah.
When we had most of our troops pulled out. In this, it was just a lightning. It was like what we've seen in Syria. It was that quick. Mm-hmm. The whole country just fell. Mm-hmm. And then you had this just chaotic pullout and all those horrible images, which really what is the most damning, well, since the television era, but especially in the social media era, to have those images is just, and Trump understands that. That's my only hope for Trump, is that he understands how damaging images and moments like that are for a presidency.
Yeah, I can help but think maybe no one really could foresee this, but someone should have taken responsibility anyway.
Yeah, that's part of the adults in the room. There has to be accountability, and there was no accountability there. I wanted to see Blinken.
Yeah,
I thought before, I was like, I don't blame the State Department, but I was like, somebody needs to take the fall because regardless of the causes, it looks like gross incompetence. And you should be shown to take action for that. I think
at least someone in the military should have.
Somebody fairly high up.
Yeah. I mean, even if it wasn't truly their fault, there needed to be some accountability, right? Yeah. They may have been mistakes, valid mistakes, but they were still definitely mistakes.
Yeah.
So
what grade are we giving?
For Afghanistan?
Yeah.
I'd give him a D.
Yeah, D-.
Yeah. I mean, it was a failure.
It was,
complete failure.
Abject failure. I mean, I try not to think about it. I mean, it is, for women and children, they're just horrific, absolute tragedy. The fact that women, had some semblance of rights from that period, 2001 to 2021, for a whole generation of women are now enslaved again under brutal Taliban rule.
I don't think we can give that to Biden, though.
No, that's the 20-year failure.
But,
right? And whether it's better to have had that moment than not, and then have it stripped away, I don't know.
I mean, what could we do, though, to keep that from happening? And the only thing would have been be permanently based in Afghanistan.
Which isn't in our strategic interest. I mean, I firmly agreed as soon as we killed bin Laden, we should pull it out. because that was the end of our interest there, other than maintaining. I mean, you wanted to be able to maintain like a small force there, similar to what we've done in Syria in order to contain ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and well, Al-Qaeda in that case, those sort of groups. But otherwise, yeah, very limited interest there.
Yeah, so it's tragic. It's also something that the U.S. can't resolve every tragedy, unfortunately. Yep. And it requires a lot of resources, to do what we were doing, let alone whether we should be there or not.
Yep. So I think then moving on, so that happened in August of 2021. And then we have the big one, probably one of the biggest defining moments for foreign policy for Biden, February 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So how would you grade Biden, or what were your thoughts kind of on how that was handled?
Starting with my thoughts, one thing that's interesting is the United States kept providing Ukraine with a lot of intelligence that Russia was preparing to invade, that Ukraine simply did not want to believe is true.
Yep.
Yeah. And Zelensky kept saying, stop doing this. You're hurting our economy. You're making things look worse than what they really are. Stop lambasting the world and us with this intelligence that you have. So I think we did what we could to prepare Ukraine, even though, I don't know. We were in a situation we didn't have the tools to keep Russia from invading. I don't know what the thinking would really be on that. So I think we can only look at how the crisis is, the war has been managed. And I think that Biden has done a really good job in providing the support to keep Ukraine from being totally taken over from Russia, which is what everyone thought would happen in the first 3 weeks, that Russia would have all of Ukraine and that, Ukraine couldn't possibly stand up to such a large nation like Russia.
And I don't think people appreciate that enough and act like, oh, this is some defeat, like where the lines are currently at. I'm like, no, everybody fully expected, including our own Defense Department, Ukraine was going to lose this war in 3 days.
Yeah.
I mean, they sent special forces into Kiev and central areas within Ukraine, and they were repelled. I mean, they did an extraordinary job of repelling those forces, and they were prepared enough, combined with the U.S. intelligence and arms shipments that had been, going in. Like the Javelin, remember the Javelin was like the key weapon early in the war, the one taking out armor on the ground and certain aircraft. Because I think the main criticism coming in with the Trump administration is that Russia invaded because Biden was weak. The Afghanistan withdrawal was so horrific and signaled such weakness that Russia saw its opportunity, combined with the fact that why didn't we just say, hey, Ukraine, you can't join NATO. Don't worry about it, Russia. Be cool. And that should have been enough to keep Russia from invading, right?
I mean, we're not addressing any of the interests that Russia has there. So if you can't address what they think that they're going to gain from invading Ukraine, and of course, this is in the context of them having previously invaded Ukraine and Georgia, I don't see how just saying, oh, don't ask for NATO membership was going to appease Russia in any way.
I mean, yeah, one, it would be not only drawn out NATO membership, but also no future arms sales to Ukraine.
That just invites Russia to invade.
Yeah, that's the only thing that Russia would agree on, though, long term. Because ultimately what they want and what triggered the whole 2014 was politically, Moscow was beginning to lose control. I mean, that was the Orange Revolution, and Ukraine was beginning to slip away from their sphere of influence. So unless they could see a way politically to undermine the regime within Kiev and, peacefully being able to, kind of through its network of oligarchs and, because Ukraine's still a considerable amount of corruption.
I was ranked like the second, before the war started, up there with Russia, like the second most country of corruption. So,
right. So, yeah, it seems entirely unrealistic. I mean, if Trump had won that second term, would Putin have invaded during that time? I say no, because I think he could have manipulated Trump to accomplish what he wants within Ukraine. So pulling out support for Ukraine over time, weakening the regime, weakening the administration with Kiev, so that you hope electorally with enough, with poor economic performance, that the reformist administration and parties lose, and then the more pro-Russia parties win. And at that point, because that's all Russia wants ultimately. It's not necessarily even the direct territorial control, although that is preferable in many ways, but to have that, as a Belarus, essentially,
right.
Just somebody you firmly have under your sphere of influence.
A couple things that I would disagree with that. I mean, one, to keep in context, Trump made a deal to provide weapons to Ukraine. I mean,
that's what got him impeached, though.
Right. But he was
withholding the weapons in order to get dirt.
Right. But he did end up giving Ukraine those weapons.
When he was called out, yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, he did end up giving, so I don't know. I mean, he's definitely wasn't pursuing a policy then. And I think the ties with Europe, the U.S. couldn't affect that. They couldn't get Europe to cut the sort of influence that it was having in political parties. So, Ukraine wanting not just NATO membership, but EU membership. And at least part of that switch in politics was increasing economic ties with Europe, which they very much wanted. And so I don't think you would see any sort of decrease in that.
Yeah.
And that's something Russia didn't want to see.
Yeah, it's hard to see a condition where, this wasn't going to happen, given that Ukraine had been trending for a number of years and was the regional cause of the Russian invasion in 2014, as they were slipping out of the former Soviet Union's control, sphere of control. And that's unacceptable because, Putin has a very imperialistic view of Russia and restoring its power. So that being said, I think, what the Biden administration was able to accomplish, particularly, and maybe we can transition because this ties directly to some of the economic approaches too, but the alliance that he put together to support Ukraine, mind you, dominated by the EU and Japan and Korea and kind of our traditional allies, but the amount of support for that, and then for the economic sanctions, which are really unprecedented, the seizure of the sovereign, the wealth fund that was overseas that Russia had built up during the high oil prices, that combined effort that's allowed Ukraine to take back some of the territory that it originally lost in that February invasion and more or less hold the line, although it's obviously beginning to slip over the last year.
Yeah, I think on both fronts. I think initially, when you go from thinking Russia's going to take over the country in a couple of days to Ukraine being able to have this strong resistance against Russia and the territory that it has managed to keep. Economically, it's interesting. I think it was unprecedented and impressive, but at the same time, it didn't collapse the Russian economy like people thought it was going to. And traditionally, my argument has always been sanctions aren't as effective as what we think they will be in weakening political ties. A lot of it targeting the oligarchs, trying to push back against Putin about the war to begin with. And I think we continue to struggle. Russia is not atypical in finding ways around U.S. sanctions, and it certainly did with the oil sanctions in being able to avoid the insurance tax. So basically, it was if you were using an insured vehicle, you could only sell your oil for so much. The cap, I think, was $60 per barrel. But if you don't use those tankers, then you don't have that cap on what you're selling oil for. Yeah. And so it was ultimately ineffective because then they just used these uninsured tankers. So I think it was amazing what they were able to do and the consensus they were able to get, even though we haven't managed to collapse Russian economy like we hoped, and just the difficulty of, even with all the financial tools we have at our disposal, in being able to do so.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and give a grade for Ukraine approach.
I think the one thing we didn't talk about was the way that we gradually increased weapons.
No, that's a good, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's certainly something we discussed a lot over the past couple of years. I'm coming around to your thinking again, where obviously the biggest criticism is we were a day late and $1 short, and every single, because there was a million different weapon systems were brought up. First it was the Abrams, then it was the F-16s, then it was the long range missiles. All of these things are seen as being like, came too late, no longer effective. But it was all with this eye towards escalation. And I think the thing that, the Biden administration was always aware of, and maybe in retrospect too cautious about, was Russia is, this is a nuclear armed power. The risk around that escalation are extreme. Trying to keep the US and NATO out of this war, and certainly out of the horror potentially of a nuclear escalation, is paramount. And thus that led to this caution. Now, mind you, in retrospect, it seems like, would that really led? Because we eventually supplied all these systems. They're regularly having these long-range strikes within Russia. Well, Russia isn't pushing for nuclear weapons. But in that year, the first year of the conflict, before Russia really dug into the trenches and increased all those intricate defenses, and ultimately led to the failure of the Ukraine counteroffensive, should we have pushed harder there? Could we have even trained their forces, to use these weapons if we had made an all-out push? We had treated this like World War II. And could that have done the trick? I mean, I don't know. I don't know if you would ever had the political will to do something that would have done that. And then maybe that would have led to the nuclear escalation, because Russia then would have a really strong chance of losing.
Well, that's the thing, is I think it would be risky, even looking back on it, where it seems like, Ukraine needed these things before we gave it to them, and it didn't cause escalation. The fact that we were so slow in doing so may be one of the things is why these weapon systems ultimately didn't cause that escalation. If they had been all there up front.
Because there's never a threat to Russian territorial control.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that as much as it was problematic in actually Ukraine getting any victories, it still made sense at the time, and is still probably the better approach, his caution. Even though, it's hard to say, because it does, maybe we wouldn't be stuck in this moment. But at the same time, like you said, if Russia was really losing, then it would have more incentive to worry about tactical nuclear weapons. At the time, it was doing those things, right? It did feel really risky. It felt risky that, that they would see this as NATO becoming directly involved. It was kind of like so much was unknowable at the time of how Russia was going to react to any of this. And the last thing you wanted to do was to provoke a nuclear war.
And that's especially with that generation, and with certainly Biden's generation, enmeshed in the Cold War. That was the number one thing. It was like to avoid nuclear war, avoid war with the Soviet Union, with Russia directly, because the consequences of that are so horrific that it's just not worth the risk. I get the caution. That being said, people like Alexander Vindman are kind of proven right by history in terms of the things that they were pushing for and the urgency that they were pushing for. I think I'll always be somewhat conflicted around this. But so I would give, the overall grade, given the situation where it stands now, given Trump's winning, I'm thinking probably a B.
Yeah, I give it. I think the preventing the overwhelming Ukraine in the beginning, the steady support that he's been able to keep up in the United States and Europe and those alliances, getting South Korea to sell weapons, munitions to Ukraine. I think there are a lot of really notable achievements. How he handled the escalation of weapons, maybe that's not perfect. So, a B. I almost would give him, a B plus, something like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair.
Which I have to say, relatively, when we're talking about world affairs, B plus is a good grade. I mean, it's hard to
it's a very good grade.
You have to have a lot of foresight and luck almost, I think, to get an A.
You have to be very extraordinary, I think, to get an A in any particular policy area.
Yeah. So I think this is, this reflects how I feel like Biden has basically done a good job.
And there's still a window for a political and ultimate victory for Ukraine. I mean, where the lines are currently at, they're going to have to give up territory, but it's not critical territory. They still have port access. They need support from the EU. The EU is going to have to step up in a big way, given the incoming administration and given the potential settlement, for a peace deal. But there's a path for a viable, strong, free Ukraine that's a member of the EU. And that's a huge victory.
Exactly.
That's a huge victory if that's realized. Some people call the Korean thing stalemate, but I think that's a victory. I mean, you look at South Korea today, I think one day we're going to look at Ukraine and be like, yeah, this is a huge victory.
I think so.
All right, I'm bumping up to B plus then.
Yeah, that's what I was saying, like a B plus. I think about as good as you could do with just some minor criticism.
Yep.
About how he handled the weapons. But where is a lot more trickier and really hard is when we get into the Hamas-Israel conflict. I mean, on one hand, it's horrific. It was horrific what Hamas did to Israel. Just should go without saying that it made it where Hamas needed to be weakened at least. I mean, you agree with the sentiment of wanting to get rid of Hamas after they committed such a horrific act on Israel. At the same time, though, the way they went about that, where the total is like 45,000 Gazans have been killed, 90% of the population is displaced, medical care is extraordinarily reduced, the hospitals are gone, the population is starving, just tremendous abuse of human rights, laws of warfare that are happening in the way Israel has conducted its war in Hamas. And something that, because of the U.S. ties to Israel, there's a legitimate reason to tie the U.S. to some extent with these atrocities.
Yeah, and that certainly has been how the progressive part of the Democrat Party has framed it for certain. And I think basically condemned the entire Biden administration because of its inactions or ineffectiveness and stopping Israel's campaign within Gaza. And just it is horrific conditions. It didn't really accomplish, a lot of the goals, or didn't accomplish it in the most roughshod way possible. That being said, I feel like this is if I could be so crude, as compared to like a football game where Israel is heading into the fourth quarter and they're behind, 21-0 from if you take it holistically and look at it from what are all the strategic goals that were kind of that Israel wants to accomplish in the region. One is the neutralization of Hamas, but one should also be like the long-term stability and prosperity of Israel and its security arrangements within the region. Everything seemed to deteriorate. Yeah, you destroyed Hamas, but you've turned public will against you. You've certainly turned allies against you. But then what happened in that fourth quarter, I don't think we can ignore. It went on a unprecedented run of kind of what Israel's reputation was in the 60s and 70s of just like hyper competence. It destroyed Hezbollah within a month in an extraordinary operation. It humiliated Iran. And mind you, this is all with kind of U.S. support and provisions. But what you find after that, and then I think we talked last time, the collapse of Hezbollah led directly to the collapse of the Assad regime. All of this enormously weakening and enfeebling Iran to the point where the Trump administration has an extraordinary opportunity to reshape the entire region in a way that is much more beneficial to the United States and to Israel, by proxy as the main ally there. So I don't feel like I can divorce the two. You have the basically a nation that I think did in its Hamas operation was so counterproductive and so destructive. But then as soon as it turned to Hezbollah and then Iran was pulled in, it delivered so many stunning victories that now it's much, 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 much better off than it was prior to October 7th.
I have two things. One, I think the football analogy, I still have trouble following that. I don't know that it really applies here, but
no, it's just,
and,
if you think about the score as a holistic, what should Israel be trying to accomplish is losing. Yeah, it's beating Hamas, but it's losing
but
the
here's
region
the thing.
in a sense.
If it destroyed Hamas, why are they still there?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the leadership has been destroyed. But it's far, in terms of operationally, it's much diminished. Now, is it completely where it can't do any operations? No. But it's very, very much diminished. But I don't think you can divorce it from its supporter, Iran, or from the much greater threat that Hezbollah supposedly was before.
So I think a couple things on this is, first to point out that the defense minister of Israel resigned because of what he said were war crimes being committed in Gaza. I just don't want to minimize that. Now, in terms of global strategic order, sure, Israel's...
Let's point this from just a real politic. I think very likely there's going to be normalization with Saudi Arabia.
Right. So
How is this not accomplishing all of Israel's and our goals within the region? Maybe the destruction of Iran as a major power within the region. If not the end of the regime itself, that's certainly possible.
I mean, strategically, yes. But is it okay to say, look, Israel did accomplish goals that the U.S. were in the U.S.'s benefit, so that's why we kept supporting weapons and didn't really punish them at all for what was happening in Gaza? Is it really okay to just not care, in the end about Gaza?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it is the action. I mean, because we are in this position, but I think unfortunately what is going to happen and where the accusations of genocide and ethnic cleansing is going to happen is in this period afterwards, where the Trump administration is going to effectively be okay with the full annexation of Gaza. And the displacement or the slow genocide, if you want to call it that, I don't know exactly the containment. Yeah, I don't know how to describe it. But the abandonment of the two-state solution. Now, part of this is on Arab powers. Arab power is enormously corrupt. The elites don't care, and the street doesn't care enough as long as their basic needs are being met. I mean, I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. If the Saudis, if MBS, right? I always forget the acronym, for the future king. If he's okay with abandoning, we're giving lip service to a Palestinian state, and they go along with that and abandon the Palestinian people, I don't know what to say. I mean, there has to be some political will within the region for that. But if they're willing to go ahead and put economics above all else, and we accomplish our geostrategic goals there, it'll be drawn up as a big victory for the U.S., even if morally the left within Europe and the U.S. will always condemn it. But how's that different than all the Iraqis that died during the Iraq War, or all the Yemenis that died, under our weapon systems that were sold to the Saudis? I mean, the starvation there is, maybe that's a future of Gaza, but it was horrific. How are any of these
stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia because of that? I mean, we did actively stop
maintaining and providing support for airstrikes.
All right, but I mean, certain weapon systems we
and that was
stopped
only Biden
providing
that
to
did
them.
that coming in. That was something that Trump fully supported, and
but my
people
point
weren't
is
necessarily up in arms like they are around.
And even
Gazans.
without being up in arms, they had a policy where they restricted weapon sales to Saudi Arabia because of Yemen.
Because I think it's also the strategic.
When we didn't do that to Israel.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is kind of that proxy war. But now that you have this, now that has led to this opportunity where Iranian power has collapsed, where Russian power has collapsed. Because that's the other thing with Syria is Russia's lost its foothold. I mean, it's trying to scramble and get a foothold in Libya in order to still have like a base, but that's kind of far outside the heart of the region. But strategically, I just feel like so much has changed in the last couple months I mean, before I would say this is a big L for the Biden administration. Big L.
I get, this fourth quarter, if that's how you want to refer to it, has been amazingly in our strategic goals in the region. I just don't think that you can ignore the human plight of what happened in Gaza.
No, I get it. I feel like the really bad stuff's probably yet to come because of what will be agreed. I mean, what you want to see, is this progress towards a two-state solution, towards regional support for rebuilding, U.S. support for rebuilding Gaza, and having some sort of justice for these innocent civilians that were caught up. Yeah, I mean, because they basically took a carpet bombing approach. I mean, these just northern Gaza's rubble.
And I mean, these are still consequences. People are starving to death and they don't have medical services.
Yeah, there's no moral justification. And that's why Biden probably paid a significant price politically. I don't know how to make it right now. It's sort of like, how do you, given the conditions, given the opportunity that just happened to come up because the way things played out, I think you have to take advantage of that opportunity and maximize the gains.
I mean, I see what you're saying. I don't know. I think it is a blemish on U.S. record, rightly so, because of humanitarian crimes. On the other hand, when this came as a voting issue, I'm just like, what do you think? Trump is going to be better? I mean, I think there was some attempt on the Biden administration to reduce the harshness of what was going on in Gaza. To try, I mean, we had the
very strange,
ill-fated, doc that we tried to put through aid, and it was a terrible idea and it didn't work. But at least we've had ideas of how to increase aid getting to Gaza. Like, we made the attempt.
Right. I mean, because it was like we were supplying the weapons that were creating the situation. And then at the same time, putting in the aid because of the weapons that we supplied. And it was very conflicted. It's like these conflicting goals going up against each other. And then Israel did not, that entire operation, you give that part of the operation F, and then the Hezbollah and everything, and then the Iran bombings, and being pretty constrained there. I mean, I think that's probably where we had the most influence. You give like an A plus. Just extraordinary. And more because of and we'll see long term. I mean, Syria, if it becomes a ISIS 2 sort of situation where you have a radical Islamic government in charge, that's not necessarily going to be in the best interest of anybody involved. But it certainly, as it stands now, represents a big opportunity to align things. I don't think you can
give them too much credit, because nobody knew intentionally when they were going after Hezbollah that it would lead to the collapse.
I don't think they were just very effective in decapitating Hezbollah.
Yeah.
And then because of that, and then the inability to rely on those proxy forces within Syria, just created opportunity for a force that had been building up kind of with Turkish influence and support over the last 5 years, that they then seized their opportunity, and Syrian government forces collapsed.
Yeah. But I mean, I think they do get credit for weakening, Iran's proxies for sure.
Yeah. So what's the overall grade for Biden's Middle East? Let's say
B minus, generously.
Yeah, I say B.
I knew you would, because of the strategic part. But we have a responsibility, I think, to do what we can to prevent these human rights abuses. And they certainly were egregious. And even within the military structure of Israel, and certainly with the defense minister and policies like that, was recognizing what was happening was wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just to conclude, kind of like, not to hash on it too much, but, we have relations with China. We have our security alliances. How do we think Biden did overall with that? I mean, certainly there was a shift in policy under Trump toward China that a lot of people thought Biden might pull back from, but instead pushed ahead, very much within that same framework.
Yeah, I think that was kind of the interesting thing reading specifically about Japan when the Biden administration was incoming, and they actually felt some hesitancy or concern that the Biden administration would revert to the Obama policy, which is more about engagement and trade and kind of the traditional relation that the U.S. had over that 25-year period before. I mean, I think, I give Trump credit in the sense that, and things are already deteriorating, certainly with China, driven, by the belligerence of Xi Jinping. It was already deteriorating. He kind of read the room and then kind of forcefully, in a very crude way, signaled that shift within U.S. policy. And basically Biden kept up the tariffs, kept up without the posturing around it, but in a much more systematic way, targeted China and competition with China. And I think one of the interesting comparisons was, you remember when Trump targeted specifically Huawei, but that was it. They had kind of these broad tariffs, and then, okay, we're going to target telecommunications company alone. But then Biden, through the CHIPS Act, through, these other provisions, takes this very systematic approach and begins to target, all of the areas, around national security or strategic importance, provides all these incentives around renewable energy, around rare earth mineral process, all those sort of components, and keeps up kind of the tariffs. And then I think most importantly, and one of the biggest part of his legacies is the alliance building within Asia. We're talking about particularly South Korea and Japan. We'll see how that is going forward. I mean, it was a big part of that was driven by the South Korean presidents. It's been since impeached, but also with the Philippines, because that relationship had turned very rocky. So kind of the trilateral agreement, the Philippines, Japan, and the U.S., the Quad, and then the big deal with AUKUS, which Biden loved bringing up, but the big submarine deal. So having a joint alliance between Australia, UK, and the US on construction of nuclear subs.
Yeah, I mean, I think going from Huawei to targeting semiconductors and stuff is a natural evolution. So I wouldn't be too harsh about that. I mean, we were focused on Huawei's telecommunication building across the world. And we were just trying to get countries, our partners in Europe, trying to, in Africa and stuff, discourage countries from, it made sense to target Huawei as a company uniquely expansive across the globe with unique security concerns in terms of China being able to infiltrate communications and stuff like that. So I think starting there makes sense considering where you're coming from and then evolving to sort of Biden's approach. I think the tariffs are a mistake. The general tariffs on 25% on a wide range of Chinese goods, which were really applied as part of a trade negotiation, not for strategic reasons, I think just raised prices for consumers and did nothing to ultimately change the relationship or China's economy. I think that Biden should have removed those tariffs and kept this focus on more strategic areas. And I think you need to be focused, especially because if you're having industrial policy, you have to balance it with not wanting to be mercantilist, go back to where everyone's using mercantilist policies against each other, economic coercion against each other, seeing it as a zero-sum game. That was terrible wars happened. It was a very terrible time for the globe. And you don't want to disrupt, I think, ultimately the benefits of international trade and exchanges, economic exchanges more generally. So if you're going to implement industrial policy to alter that and saying, well, not all trade was beneficial, and certainly in some ways may even threaten our national security, you have to be very focused. And I think Biden could have been a little bit more focused if he had gotten rid of some of those tariffs.
Yeah, but I think it's the political messaging of it. And I think, ultimately, this administration is going to go down as collectively, not just Biden, but collectively as some of the worst communicators in all
That's
of
true.
presidential history, at least since the modern media. Just absolutely horrific about getting the message out and framing the message. Because I agree. I mean, I think we talked about before, like when inflation was raging at 9%, kind of at its peak in 2022, we talked about, hey, what about like getting rid of these tariffs on Chinese goods? Because, I mean, yeah, I know exports don't make up like a huge part of the economy, but they do make up a pretty big part of like the consumer, for the U.S. consumer. And even if it reduced inflation by 1%,
right? I mean,
that would be huge.
Economics, that's
that
what
would be huge. And if you framed it this way, where if you communicated better that this is not strategically important, but I'm focused on helping the American people, I'm getting rid of this. This doesn't really benefit China that much. We're introducing all these other tariffs that are targeting kind of around our national security, critical areas where we really need to protect our industries and whatnot. But, it didn't exist. They didn't have the capacity for that. And anything around appearing weak with China it seemed like a non-starter.
Which, is a little ironic because China wasn't even really much part of the presidential debates and the thinking that went into people's choices. But I think there's some extraordinary diplomacy that Biden underwent on China, which was, to begin with, in his administration, Europe had made an investment treaty deal with China. Mm-hmm. And it only got scrapped because of the pressure Biden put on our European allies. And that the semiconductor restrictions relied very heavily on getting companies like ASML, a Dutch company, to agree to stop selling the machine. And they had to put a lot of pressure on them. It wasn't automatically that they agreed to restrict this because the U.S. said to do that. So there was a lot of diplomacy that went into that, the restrictions to semiconductor cells from Japan and all these other countries. And it was a pretty extraordinary effort that they were able to get countries to eventually go along with the U.S.'s semiconductor policy.
Yeah, no, I think that is a big part of what they accomplished, and just getting that kind of alliance with allies in terms of how we're going to approach China and kind of the unique challenge that they are reflecting. I think the other thing that probably helped, especially with Europe, was China's support for Russia. Following the Ukraine war. I think the other interesting thing here, probably also to Biden administration, maybe part of the effectiveness of the economic coercion, is Chinese support for Russia has been limited for the most part. I mean, there's definitely components that are going in and coming through Central Asia that affect, and help the war machine within Russia, but actual weapons components themselves were not being supplied by China. Mm-hmm. So I think that points to another success, kind of how they've managed that.
The threat process of severe economic sanctions.
Yeah.
I think that you should get credit for that. Those are kind of the things that people don't see as much.
Now, how about the argument, and because China's the center of this, but this rise of this axis, so China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. People are seeing this as, because of U.S. weakness and incompetence, we're forcing, these, and maybe because of the framing, like Biden at the beginning of the administration, this framing of democracy versus autocracy, we're forcing these disparate countries together and they're cooperating more militarily, trade. I mean, we saw North Korea's actively sent thousands of troops in and are actively engaged in combat with Ukraine. How much do we blame Biden for that? Is that a major threat? Because a lot of Trump people are saying this is incompetence too. We should have either, you have the tech bro wing. They're saying, we should easily be able to break off China, from this group, because these other countries are a bunch of losers China's the only one that's, has that relationship, and we can form with, and
because
obviously
they don't care about the national security interest, right?
They don't care about that. They care about making money. Versus the Bannon wing, which is more like China's the number one national security enemy, and we share both ethnicity and religion with in values with the conservative Russians. We should be allied with Russia against China.
I don't see a real axis evolving here. They certainly are not allied in the same way that we have alliances. They act transactionally when their interests converge. And in terms of Russia, Ukraine, their interests, have converged in wanting to weaken. They all have reasons why they want to weaken the United States and its power. And I think it makes sense. China's benefiting greatly from the sale of Russian oil. I mean, they push hard. They're not just generously doing that. They are pushing hard against prices and taking advantage of what they can get out of Russia.
Natural gas deals going forward.
So, I mean, they're pursuing their interest as they perceive them. And I don't know, you have to have an axis just to act upon your own interests.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I find it annoying when they compare like this agreement, this transactional agreement between these four disparate countries is similar to like the US's alliance network. And I'm like,
it's
not at all in terms of depth and meaning and consequence. Yeah, it's not the same.
I mean, look at type of support that we provided Ukraine, direct weapons and such. China hasn't provided that to Russia.
Yeah.
There aren't these strong ties between them, but they do have overlapping interests. And they do pursue those interests.
Yeah. So what's the grade for Biden's China policy overall?
That's interesting. I guess a B.
Can't point to anything that is glaringly bad on this. I mean, I think this is the one part where Washington kind of agrees. There's a certain agreement around China and the unique challenge that it represents. And I think the alliance, I think a great job, particularly around the reconciliation between South Korea and Japan and the alliance building there. So, yeah, I think a solid B.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm somebody who thinks the tariffs should have been gotten rid of, the general tariffs that Trump
If you can communicate in this administration, ooh-wee. No bueno at the communication.
So I think that definitely is something they did wrong. But other than that, I think that they did some pretty extraordinary things. I mean, how substantial some of these security alliances or just alliances in general, organizations that they put together, I'm just not sure. But in enacting their policies and needing other countries to cooperate with that, and just in general, drawing Europe away from China, I think has been really significant. And, one of the ironies of the incoming administration is that it wants to be tough on China, but it weakens these ideas, the importance of alliances, which if we want to counter security interests of China, we very much need cooperation from our partners.
Yeah, because that's a huge part of our strategic advantage. If we're potentially looking weak from an industrial base like standpoint as the U.S. alone, we certainly need allies and, just kind of that amount, just the amount of nations kind of in that region that allow us to, still be able to project that force or to create, because this is all about creating deterrence, creating significant enough deterrence. And you need allies in order to do that within the region. And if you go it alone, we just, we're very exposed from an industrial capacity standpoint. Going back to the AUKUS thing, we can't produce the subs. A lot of people are concerned that the AUKUS deal will be scrapped because you've had Republican members of Congress raise the rightful point that we can only produce 1.2 subs a year. That's not enough for us, let alone for Australia and the UK.
Yeah,
so we need to. This seems like that would be a constructive thing for like Doge or the administration to focus on is that industrial capacity. And
how is Doge going to increase industrial capacity?
Man, he's a genius. Come on. He's Tony Stark. He can fill it away. He can figure out a way to build those subs better. We know it.
I don't know how that cuts money from the government, which is what he says he's trying to do. But sure, Elon, please. I mean, we have to put
very cool, smart predator drones, subsea predator drones
something
that are going to like wipe out the Chinese fleet.
Well, something. I mean, Elon, we have to put up with your annoyingness, so at least contribute, something positive here. Solve our submarine problem.
Yeah, not to go too off track, but you'll like this as a gamer. Did you know that Elon was like a top 20 player on Diablo 4?
No.
He can not only run 6 companies, single-handedly win a U.S. election, run the Department of Government Efficiency, but also have time to grind through Diablo 4 and be a top 20 player, which he bragged about on X, and he says like 60 posts a day on X too. This dude must not sleep any or eat or bathe. So, yeah, of course he's going to be able to say that. Look at what if he just needs to drop the Diablo, that alone is going to free up enough time to come up with the Predator drones or super efficiencies in constructing nuclear subs. I mean, come on.
Yeah, you wouldn't know he has 12 kids, too, that he should pay some attention to, which I'm sure he does not.
Beyond naming them, I think that's just...
Yeah, solve that problem. So we're giving, what did you say?
B.
You gave him a B. Yeah, we gave him B.
Yeah.
So overall, how do we evaluate Biden's foreign policy?
Well, because every president has like a different, in terms of the challenges that are thrown their way. And yeah, I agree the Afghanistan thing is kind of like a cell phone. I mean, that was existing. That's been existing for 20 years.
Did you say like a cell phone?
Cell phone.
Oh, cell phone.
You just,
sorry.
That's on you. You're not.
Right.
You're not,
yes.
Yeah. He's had a tough run for 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you think about it. We have the biggest war on the European continent since World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Had a major. I mean, the Middle East is always kind of unstable, so it's not so surprising that you have a major. But then for Israel and Iran to directly come real close to blows, you haven't had anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
So on 2 fronts, pretty extraordinary issue. And then the pandemic and China. So I think very rough road.
Mm-hmm.
Up there with W
Mm-hmm.
in those 4 years after 9/11.
Well,
Up there with that in terms of the challenge. And well, no, not in grade. We're not getting the grade. No, he did better than W. He did better than W. So I'm laying on a solid B-.
Yeah.
Brought down because of Afghanistan. And yeah, obviously the situation in Gaza.
you gave him a B for all that, so I don't know why you're...
Yeah, but you're guilting me into like... I'm like, presidents have an extraordinarily difficult job. And
yeah,
ultimately it's kind of
messy.
balancing. Yeah, it's
a
worst
messy
job.
world.
But in terms of like the level of difficulty heading into it, I mean, this is definitely on hard mode,
Mm-hmm.
foreign policy wise, which Biden was well equipped going in.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he had the background to handle hard mode, unlike Clinton, who was on friggin' cheat mode. I don't know, cheat code during all the 90s.
What?
It was a easy period for the U.S. during the 90s, during that period of the 90s.
I don't think he was cheating, though.
Yeah, but I'm just saying it was so easy that it was kind of like a cakewalk.
Yeah.
That was hard to screw up.
Yeah.
Even though Clinton was probably pretty well equipped to handle foreign policy.
You think? He was governor of Arkansas.
I felt like he had the team and...
Yeah, he had a good team.
He had a good team. He
was a very team sort of oriented kind of president. But him personally, I don't think he knew a lot about foreign policy.
But he's pretty capable. He's been he's much great. I'd say he's one of the smarter presidents that we've had. Like, just has horsepower and energy to handle, and a great communicator.
I think we're a little off track, but yeah.
Okay. Anyway, what were we talking about? Yeah, that was
B-.
B- for Biden.
All right.
What about you?
Oh, B- for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. I think he's done some things very well, but there's Gaza, Afghanistan. Wouldn't say it's a horrible score, though, given just the range. I mean, who's going to give an American president an A in the post-Cold War era with all of the messiness that's going on? So,
post-Cold War? Well, I mean, Bush Sr.
He was like that.
He was at the very tail end.
Yeah, I count that as
Cold
being
War ended under him.
Right. So I don't really
count. Yeah. It's tough. It's much messier. It's very tough to get a good grade.
So it's a really, really hard class. So he gets a B-, and that's pretty solid.
Yeah.
So do we think the U.S., though, here's a good question to end on, I think. Okay. Do we think the U.S. is better off today than it was 4 years ago?
From, like, what perspective? Overall? All? Everything?
Geopolitical.
Yeah, I've been giving this some thought, and I'm landing on the side that yes. But it's not strictly due to Biden, but just kind of the way things have played out maybe in other countries. And the reasoning behind this is a lot of it's driven by China, that China is relatively weaker than it was at the time. And I think you definitely see that played out in terms of relative, like,
depends
economic
on who you
power.
talk to.
I know there's different ways of measuring it, but I feel like China is on a downward track. China has many issues going on coming out of COVID.
I think that's overly exaggerated.
I mean, we'll see. They're not facing any easier economic situation under a Trump administration. I think that's the one thing we can be pretty certain about. And they're not going to be able to export their way out of their problems. And they have major issues. That feels like a mulligan, like, oh, well, because China's messed up. And U.S. economically is in a very strong position.
Yeah.
It came out. And that, I mean, a lot of geopolitical strength comes down to economic strength. How do you look at the situation with Russia and this idea that we're bleeding them?
Mm-hmm.
We're bleeding a major strategic competitor. They've lost, in terms of wounded, maybe up to 1 million.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of their equipment, their economy is isolated from Europe. Yeah, they formed these new networks within Asia, but are they better off? I don't think so. I mean, I've argued also before, will Russia emerge from that? I guess it will depend on kind of what sort of agreement is negotiated. So kind of from these perspectives of economic and relative to China, I feel like, yes, the U.S. is better off. And then you factor in the Middle East. I think unquestionably the U.S. is strategically better off, and Iran is at the point of collapse almost in terms of as a regional power, if not the regime itself.
I was going to say kind of the same, but you convinced me a little bit that we're in a much better position in the Middle East.
Oh, yeah.
I don't agree so much the relative power towards China. I don't see that is really shifted.
Well, GDP it has. It's definitely shifted GDP.
By like a percent or two. I mean, not anything substantial. Trajectory. If you say so.
They're barely growing. And they're probably lying about their numbers anyway.
I mean, just for that pure GDP perspective, but if you look at the resources they're putting into innovation and industrial capacity and their military.
I would say, I think the biggest concern is the military, because that's been an extraordinary buildup. Mm-hmm. And then us being flat-footed. I mean, the thing with Ukraine that should wake up us and our allies is industrial capacity, lack of munition, lack of ability to wage a long-term war with a near-peer rival. I mean, I feel like you deal with this all the time. You tell me, are we woken up? Are we making?
No.
Are we taking? No, we're not woken up. See, this is a big problem.
You know, people say we need a Sputnik moment, but what would a Sputnik moment
The loss
look
of
like?
the Pacific Fleet is what it's gearing up towards.
I mean, so no, there are some people, serious people who are in Washington who want to see that addressed, but I don't think that I think even within the Trump administration, there's small voices, not big ones.
Yeah, so I think that's it's from a macro side, better off, but then from these areas where we may really run up against it, probably worse off, like militarily.
Yeah.
I think we're probably worse off, yeah.
So, mixed. I think that covers it, right?
Yep.
I mean, it doesn't cover as much as we can get to.
A long time ago,
right.
But
we don't want this to be a 6-hour episode.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the end of this episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kelloggsglobalpolitics.com and follow us on X at Global Kellogg or me at AR Kellogg.
You can also reach us by email. So Anita at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com. As always, please see the show notes for the articles we discussed in this episode.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.